Pete, house in Baltimore, uniting with some friends, old and new, and it's been about a month or two since we've had this guy on. He's one of our defending champions around here. We call him our sports business professor of education. The great Marty Conway joins us again. You can follow him out on Twitter at Marty Conway, as well as on LinkedIn. He is one of our favorite guests to have on. He was the longtime executive with the Baltimore Orioles back in the 1980s in the Edward Bennett Williams, Larry Lucchino era. And then moved on to the Texas Rangers in the early 90s under George W. Bush and ran some things, did some things, and now does all things education and sports business at Georgetown University, as well as working in Qatar, amongst other places. Marty, where you been all summer? Let's just first start with catching up with you. You've just been one of those guys, much like our great President Trump, who read a lot of books this summer, right?
Well, it's an interesting comparison. So I've taken a bit of a social media hiatus so I could dig. I've got a big bag of books and take it with me wherever I go.
What are you reading? What are your bag of? Is this? This is not Kindle. These are like real books, right?
No, these are real books. You turn the page. The one book and I would recommend this to people who love baseball, particularly if you want any insights into the Orioles. Jake Arrieta. There's a great book by Sports Illustrated baseball writer Tom Verducci called The Cubs Way, and he was given really just free access to the Cubs during the 2016 season and then after, and he wrote a very compelling, easy-to-read book about the 2016 Cubs season. The primary focus is on the World Series, and he goes game by game, but after he does his analysis of the game, he goes back, and there's a very interesting chapter, or at least a big part of a chapter, about the Jake Arrieta times in Baltimore and how he got to Chicago. And ultimately, it's just great scouting by Theo Epstein and his team. And they had identified Arrieta as a guy. At the end of every year, Epstein has his scouts do what he calls a change of scenery survey, and they all can submit names of players that they think, just by virtue of a change of scenery, would be better off, and Arrieta was on that list. And so when the time came to do the Scott Feldman trade, Arrieta was a guy that was available, and so it was very easy to make the deal. And then with some additional pitching support and analysis from Chris Bosio, they were able to correct some things that the Orioles pitching staffs, many staffs, apparently hadn't been able to find, and they were able to put Jake in a different position, and now he's done what he's done. So I've read that book. I read a book by Sheryl Sandberg, who had written a great female leadership book a few years ago, and then tragically lost her husband in a sudden accident, sudden death. And she wrote a really good book about resiliency. So I've read 2 or 3 of those. Kind of read a couple business books, so a little sports, a little business, a little leadership. And I'm trying to work my way through a book now on how Airbnb as a company was started. So that's kind of where I'm at on that.
I'm writing books, you're reading books, and the Orioles are involved. And so next week, and this is the first time, Marty, that I've done a sort of books on tape, right? I've written 4 books. I've only read one of them. I read my first Peter, when I did the walk ad on Peter in 06, I wrote a book about my father, my love of baseball, and why the Orioles, and why baseball was important to me. It almost feels silly to me 11 years later on the back end of this, but here we go again over the next 2 weeks, and I literally found the Peter Principles, 13 chapters, fully written, about 70,000 words that I had done 4 years ago. Jen got cancer. I put it away. I never looked at it. I broke it out, incidentally, on my trip out to Vancouver and to Portland to drink beer with Maury Brown, amongst others, and see you too. And I decided to just start releasing it. Now I've been reading it, and it is fascinating. First off, how much he has in common ideology-wise with Donald Trump and the way he conducts himself, just quite frankly, and how he conducted himself in the 1990s with newspapers and the media and fake news and such. And Ken Rosenthal, who's back in the news, reporting this week that, again, Angelos is involved in the Machado story in these relief pitchers, where Showalter is, where Duquette is, where the Machado, Jones, Brock, and Britton, where they are in their contract. Boy, Marty, you went away a little bit, and I like the last time we talked, the Orioles were still very much sort of in the buying mode and very much in the race. that doesn't feel to be the case after the Cubs broke the brooms out over the weekend. These are really, really important weeks for the Orioles, these next 2 weeks, not just for the Orioles, for any MLB team, for strategy, for money, for budgets, for prospects, for self-evaluation and honest self-evaluation. And I don't know that the Orioles have ever been good at any of this, right?
They've not proven it to this point, and I think, to your earlier point about this being an important time, what you see inside the front office of a team, particularly one like the Orioles that have not sold, let's just say not sold a lot of full season tickets, and you'll see here in the next week or two, just your advanced sales begin to really dry up. You're trending since the middle of May roughly. I think they've been about 12 or 15 games or more under 500 during that time. And you start to see that show up in your advanced sales.
Even bobblehead night doesn't work as well in August when you stink, right? I mean, even those nights become... Hey, they had empty seats for the Cubs over the weekend. I mean, lots of them on Sunday, lots. Saturday they had plenty. That unto itself is really, really telling in the middle of summer when the world champions are coming in that way, right?
Yeah, well, the Cubs have their following just like the Dodgers do and the Braves did in their heyday and things like that because of national media, national reputation. But, some of that's going to happen. The Red Sox have a little bit of that too, obviously. But really the biggest difference is around the middle of August, early August, is when most of that advanced sale just begins to stop. You've got back to school, you've got universities going back to business, you've got people going back to business, they go on vacation. So that's really where your advanced sales and your season ticket sales carry you. Promotional days and fireworks days and bobbleheads can only do a certain amount. So I'm sure that they will see, and you will see, as you observe in terms of the crowds, they will diminish over time. And regardless of what they do, whether they make trades or don't make trades, people are going to, change their habits, change their plans, start thinking about football, college football, any other kinds of things, and a baseball ticket. If it's available at a deep discount or it's free, people will go. But they start to make other choices, and they recognize, the nature of the season. If this spiral continues, and at this point looks like it, certainly will.
Do the numbers matter as much as they did in your era? I mean, I would think back in the 1980s, this was a real decision about hold 'em, fold 'em, do we, shouldn't we? Really, in the last decade, last 15 years, that's changed for all of these teams, right? Like, no one is really bleeding, red ink at this point, to the point where any of these sell-offs are anything other than getting a cheaper payroll and making more profit, not losing less money, right?
Yeah, because what's happened over time is the sort of ranking of revenues. Ticket revenues are dropping. They're not dropping out of the top five, but they're no longer first or second. They might be fourth or fifth. After certainly media revenues are number one, and then you have national revenues coming from Major League Baseball, including media, including sponsorship, including licensing. That's up there. And then you start to see sponsorships and other kinds of things. So ticket revenue clearly matters, but it just matters less than it used to. So it's a variable revenue, and it continues to slide down in terms of, so point being is most of the money that the Orioles are going to make, or the Nationals or whoever you're talking about, has really been made with the exception of being in contention for the postseason, which would then allow you to sell, advanced season tickets for the following year during that end of the season and postseason. So that's where you can make some real marginal revenues. If you're just competing for the second wild card and people really don't think you're much of a postseason contender, you lose all that opportunity. So there's a few teams like the Orioles did in 2012 when they made that run and people got pretty excited and put down deposits for the following year. But for the most part, all the major revenues are booked. They're contracted. That's where all the value comes from, is in contracted revenue, not in the kind of individual ticket revenues that you might get here in the last 6 weeks of the season.
He is Marty Conway. He runs things, including the Orioles and the Texas Rangers over the years. He's now a professor of all things sports and business and economics at Georgetown University. He is one of our defending champs and friends. And you can and should follow him out on Twitter at Marty Conway, as well as on LinkedIn at Marty Conway, where he sometimes opines about things like summer reading and sports and business. You know, on the baseball side of this, Marty, you and I never really nerd out. You know, I mean, we're always talking about business and esoterics and fringe things and management, which is where your mind and your heart has been over 30 years. But I'm sure you have a lot of baseball thoughts in that brain of yours, having watched all of this. And I'm sure the buying and the selling of players at the trading deadline and how all of these teams, their lives have been made a lot more complicated by this second wild card, right? Like it is this brass ring that anyone on or around 500 or even 3 or 4 games below 500 looks at and says, well, we could be that team that's going to play 12, 15 games over 500, 3, 4 games over 500 the next 3 months. 4 games this month, 3 games, and all of a sudden, hey, we're a 521 team, and we're going to be in the race in September. Let's go all in. And you had the Orioles on the fringe of this, but clearly Tampa's involved in this now. Minnesota's involved in this. Kansas City's going to be involved in this. Seattle, Texas, not to mention the Nationals and the Cubs, who already made deals in Quintana over the weekend. Milwaukee's going to be involved, and those 3 teams out on the West. There's going to be a lot of buyers out there, and then there's a lot of bad baseball teams out there as well that have to sell, that they're not on the fence. But if you're anywhere near the fence, this is a tough sort of couple of weeks to try to figure out what you are, not only on your baseball side, but for what your management and your ownership, whether their name is Angelos or not, thinks about this. I mean, the Yankees sold off famously last summer, and I know you and I talked about it, and that was something that they really had to consider about how much money it was going to cost them, right?
Yeah, and of course in the Yankees case, they also had a very clear plan as to what they were going to do with that. In some cases, it was to sign back, on Aroldis Chapman, sign back a player that they were trading away. So they had every intent of trading him for the last 6 weeks, getting that load of prospects, and then going right back after him in terms of free agent money. So it really comes down to a refined strategy, if you will. And yeah, everyone, I think, believes that they can be the modern-day Kansas City Royals of a few years ago, who got hot at the end of the season, picked up that second wild card, and rode it all the way to the World Series, and then what that did for them in the following year. So,
well, even what the Rangers did 2 years ago, or what the A's did, right? I mean, the A's folded up, and the Rangers came from nowhere, and, those stories are there for teams that are middling the first half of the year, right? And especially teams that and their pitching gets better in the second half, and they make that sort of vital move in 2 weeks.
Yeah, and so the other thing that does is it doesn't mean that if you're making sell deals at the trade deadline or when the season is over, for that matter, that you're necessarily eliminated from the following year because of that presence of that second wild card. So you have circumstances like the Yankees and a couple other teams that you mentioned that might have flipped some players, but the following year they were right back in it. The absence of that second wild card used to mean that if you were out of it, you were looking at maybe, selling your team off and being a 3-year project to turn it around. That clearly isn't the case anymore. And in fact, when I go back and look at the book that I told you about the Cubs, Theo Epstein took over in 2012, and they were not very good for 2012, 2013, 2014. They had high draft picks. They were sort of like the Nationals. They hit on those high draft picks. It wasn't until 2015 and going into 2016 where they really, became the sort of team that they were. So I think people looking at 5-year rebuilds anymore, that's just really not the case. It's very rare. Baseball, because of the financial pressure of the dollars being so big, the payrolls being 150, 60, 70, or over $200 million, there's a lot of pressure, and there's no opportunity really anymore to just sit back and say, well, we're going to recast this team and this organization in a different way, and it's going to take 3 to 4 years. That's a lifetime to fans, and you really, in today's games, whether it's football, baseball, or basketball, you risk losing almost a half a generation of fans if you try to do that.
We hear on Sunday that the Orioles would not do business with the Washington Nationals. I guess they don't want Darren O'Day or Zach Britton, converting the last out of a Game 6 World Series win in a Nationals uniform. But, the whole idea is to fleece the other teams. You've often referred to Mr. Angelos as, quote, unorthodox. And I think that that's a great word to be using at this point. But where the Red Sox are and where the Yankees are and where the Orioles are and if you're not going to deal with the Red Sox and the Yankees and the Nationals, you've really eliminated a lot of your potential suitors now, haven't you?
Well, yeah, if you're not going to, it's one thing not to trade within your division, and I think a lot of clubs in any sport are very reluctant to do that because of the damage it does to that on the hot seat general manager. But to say that you're not going to do anything with a team 30 miles down the road that has a huge treasure trove of minor league prospects, my lord, the deals that the Nationals have made over the last 2, 3, 4 years, they have spread prospects around Major League Baseball like it's nobody's business. So they clearly are an organization that seems to be able to draft and develop quality talent. And if you're going to, whitewash 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 teams like that, it's going to make it that much harder for you to find organizations that have the kind of prospects, number one, and secondly, need the players that you have, like you mentioned, whether it's bullpen help, whether it's third base help, or catching, or anything like that. It just makes the prospect that much harder to find the right partner because it does take the buy, but it also takes the sell, and you've got to have that sort of match. So you've already seen a couple teams make the moves already. It's no longer people waiting to the deadline. Pretty much the All-Star break is now the point of which teams begin to make in Major League Baseball. They begin to make improvement deals or to get rid, because for a pitcher it's an additional 2 or 3 starts. For a position player it's an additional 10 or 12 games. There's really no sense in waiting to the trade deadline anymore if you're really intent on improving your team from mid-July on.
Yeah, the Cubs already got their first start out of Quintana and won it on Sunday. Marty Conway joining us here, our sports professor of all things business at Georgetown University and longtime Major League Baseball executive. This is an interesting summer, I think, with the Houston Astros coming in here this week, and I'll talk to some people in Houston later on in the week, but such a unique thing that a franchise that really has not had a lot of success over the year. They had their Bagwell Biggio and their World Series run over a decade ago, but by and large, the brand hasn't been all that good over the course of time with full stadiums, and they've changed their uniforms, I think, more than any other team this side of the Padres. But for this year, with a team like that, a team like the Milwaukee Brewers, they've put some throwback duds on, Arizona, Colorado, even Tampa Bay having a little bit of resurgence in Minnesota. Boy, these are the times where you're building your franchise for the sell-offs. And the Orioles have had 5 years of pretty good prosperity here under Buck and during this Adam Jones period of time and Chris Davis and those deals that we fail working out well. If that thing is crested, and maybe it has in Toronto where we've seen, unprecedented ticket sales the last few years. San Francisco's had that kind of success, as has Detroit. A lot of teams kind of falling upon hard times here this year. And, this is the building period for the Houstons and some of these organizations. You mentioned the Nationals. That thing continues to get bigger, and they had their own set of problems last week, screwing over the fans and fake rain delays and Lord knows whatever else, that fans get a little sensitive when the building gets bigger, too. There's less things you can get away with when you've got 40,000 people waiting for a ball game, right?
Yeah, and so you mentioned Houston. That's an interesting project. And so when you dig in and talk to people, not only will you talk about their general manager on the baseball side, but you should ask people about Reed Ryan, who's Nolan Ryan's son. Reed took over as president of the organization, I think maybe 2 years now. And so in that 2 or 2.5 years, Reed inherited, like you mentioned, a club that was in a very difficult position, wasn't drawing well, didn't really have much in the way of talent. And in that 2 or 3 year period, they've done a pretty quick about face under his guidance, along with their baseball side, their general manager and stuff. But yeah, this is the point. Like the point being is you can see that the kind of haul of prospects in baseball that good scouting can deliver for you in these times where you might have 1 or 2 players, whether it's a Zach Britton, a Darren O'Day, or somebody else like that, where you can extract 2, 3, sometimes 4 players for one, And it's a very tempting thing to do. Now the question is this the right time to do it, or is in the off season, in that December, January period, the time to do it? So it takes a lot of strategy. And yes, the Orioles have had a 500 and above run here for the last 5 years, and you have to start to think about how long can that practically go on as players either age or pick up innings or their contract status changes. And the one thing that you can say about organizations that are successful in today's market, whether you're talking about Golden State or whether you talk about New England Patriots, whoever it is, it's adaptation. They have a philosophy, but they're willing to adapt as they go. Those are the organizations that are constantly making these adaptations and staying within the top, always making the playoffs and giving themselves a chance to win a World Series or a World Championship. And I think more so than ever at the leadership level in sports, being able to adapt to the industry as it changes quickly is the difference between, executive leadership that brings home championships and executive leadership that doesn't quite bring home championships.
Concerned about the listless nature of the Orioles franchise right now, sort of this malaise that's going on at the end of a deal for Buck and for Duquette. And, if this organization is going to be dealing from its best players and resources for prospects, is Dan Duquette really the guy you want making those deals right now? And I know, your answer may be a little different than the unorthodox Peter Giangelo's, but this is a weird couple of weeks, I think, all the way around, and there'll be a lot of judgment about all of this and whether Machado should or shouldn't or will or won't be dealt and will or won't be signed in a year where he kind of looks a little adrift right now as a baseball player.
Well, I think you got to unpack each of those, and each of them are a different case and a difficult case. The first is whether you want this current leadership, not just Dan Duquette, but this current leadership team, his player development people, his scouts, et cetera, to be the people that are doing that sort of rebuild mode. That's going to be hard to see. The other question, on the case of whether it's a Machado or a Zach Britton, these are very different cases. In the case of Manny Machado, the question really is, does he want to sign here, period? So forget what the money is. Let's just say that the money was equal to New York or Los Angeles or Texas or wherever. Is this a place that he wants to stay and build his baseball future? Chris Davis clearly did. He didn't have as many options as Manny Machado had, but he clearly decided this was a place to do.
As did Markakis and Adam Jones and anybody else that ever took, a big piece of money from them, right?
Yeah, so I think that's the question. Now, in the case of a player like Zach Britton, that's a different story. Getting value from a reliever, extracting value for either half of this season or all of next season, whatever the prospect is, I think you're more likely to see moves made around players like that as opposed to a potential franchise player like a Machado, because you want to have a serious postseason discussion with his representatives, really look them in the eye and see if they're really interested in potentially staying in a market like this. And if you clearly walk away and feel like they're not, then I think you can make better decisions in the off season around players like that with a year to go in their contract versus a bullpen arm that you don't know whether you're going to be in a position to have a need to spend $10 or $11 million, as a last person, a stop or a save in the bullpen,
which they haven't wanted to do on either Jim Johnson, certainly Andrew Miller. I mean, they had around. They had opportunities to do that. I mean, even going back to B.J. Ryan, for crying out loud. I mean, they just haven't been that team, right?
Yeah. So I think you analyze your team and what's coming up, and so I think those deals might be easier to make at this point in the season or during the season. A Machado type player, I think that takes a lot. If I'm the owner or I'm the owner's representative, I want to see a lot more discipline on that analysis before I'm willing to, accept 3 players or 4 players or whatever it is on that. So I think from a fan standpoint, you can look at more, spare part pieces maybe moving during the season or as the season moves along. But I think, key position players, I just don't see an organization dealing like that at this point in the season. I think that's unrealistic to even think about. But you never know what you're going to get offered. So That's the other part of it. You don't know who's talking to whom.
Watching all this soccer ball get kicked around here this summer, it does make me realize we are 1 year away from Moscow. Interesting, huh? And I know 5 years out now on Qatar and what you've been working on over there in the Middle East. It is, there has to be a little turmoil around this World Cup for next year so far, right?
Yeah. I think the Russian World Cup has gotten completely overlooked on the global landscape by people, looking at 2022 in Qatar and all the issues that have popped up over years on that. But there's, I think as people start to bring this one into focus, as teams start to qualify, and that qualification rounds will begin to conclude, around September. I think the U.S. team, if they're going to qualify, we're going to know for sure by September. And then people, I think, will turn their attention to the issues that might go along with qualifying and then ultimately participating at a World Cup in Russia. So if you think you've heard a lot about Russia now because of our political and media crosswinds, you can't wait until you start to hear about, everything related to doping and all kinds of corruption and different things related to Russian athletics.
Murdered journalists, just little things like that.
Yeah, all sorts of things like that. So it is time. It's starting to come, but I think you'll start to see more about that in September as the World Cup field solidifies and we pretty much know who's going. Because, look, if the U.S. for some reason didn't qualify for the World Cup, you're just not going to hear much in the way of media coverage about next year's World Cup if the United States isn't there.
The highways are jammed with broken heroes on a last-chance power drive, so says the Twitter of Marty Conway. You can follow him at Marty Conway. He is our executive sports professor of all things logic and sensibilities around here on the eve of the trading deadline. Marty, it's always good to catch up with you, man. Love you, miss you, and at some point we'll maybe get a crab cake, a ball game, and an ice cold beverage together. We've been threatening to go to a baseball game together for years. We should probably do it at some point, I think.
Well, I think we're going to have no trouble getting a ticket if we want to get in by the end of August or whenever you've gotten back from where you're going to be and where I'm going to be. So maybe that will be our opportunity to do it.
Don't be so cruel to Mr. Angelos, Marty. Have a heart. Great to have you on, man, as always. All right, we'll see you soon.
Okay, thank you.
There he goes, Marty Conway. You can follow him out on Twitter as well as at LinkedIn. He is, if he's not my all-time favorite, he's in my top 10. I don't think there's any doubt about that. You can find me out in the Buy a Toyota Audio Vault 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device by downloading the TuneIn Radio app. Don't forget the Peter Principles, Chapters 9, 10, 11 coming next week. I've been doing the books on audio series you can check out in the Buy a Toyota Audio Vault as well. Nasty at WNST.net finds me. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, streaming live on our Facebook as well as our YouTube WNSTV channel. Luke's at the ballpark all week. He will be in Owings Mills next week when the Ravens get it kicking. Happy for Coach Billick that he's going to be kicking the preseason as well. We love him on behalf of the Living Classrooms Foundation and all of his partnership and generosity here as well. So all is well, all is calm, except for the Orioles trading deadline, which is a mess right now, which we'll continue to discuss. I am Nestor. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.